Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this roundtable, yet another virtual or digital roundtable organized by the Elcano Royal Institute and coming to you live from Madrid, Spain. This afternoon, we brought together a group of experts to look at the European Union's response to the pandemic and basically to try and understand how the pandemic is going to affect the future of the European Union at various different levels and in various different policy areas. And to help us do this, we have three excellent speakers. Ilke Toigur, our very own analyst at the Elcano Royal Institute, Nikolai von Ondarza, who is the deputy head of the research division on Europe and the EU at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Berlin. Thank you very much, Nikolai, for joining us. And Rosa Balfour, who is director of Carnegie Europe. And the way we've divided this up, thank you all of you then for your presence here. This, by the way, is being recorded, of course, and those of you who can't join us for the whole session will, of course, be able to revisit it through YouTube. The way we've divided this up thematically is as follows. Ilke will kick off with some thoughts about the impact of the crisis, both on the internal dynamics of some member states and also the institutional dynamic within the European Union as a whole. And she will also make a few remarks, I hope, about how some of the tensions that were already visible within the European Union between certain states and certain groups of states may have been affected by all of this. I think many of us probably agree with what Giuseppe Borrell, the HRVP, was saying and writing about the other day when he basically described the pandemic as an accelerator, as a phenomenon which is accelerating tendencies and events which were already in evidence in different ways. Our second speaker, Nikolai, will be talking to us essentially about where we move from here, where we go from here under the German Presidency, which, as you all know, starts on the 1st of July. And we were just discussing off camera that what might otherwise have been a rather lackluster German presidency now obviously has a very significant and meaty agenda ahead of it. So maybe actually we in the EU have been extremely lucky this time that the presidency happens to be in German hands, or will be in German hands very shortly, given the magnitude of some of the decisions that need to be taken. And finally, Rosa will be looking at how the pandemic is affecting and will affect the EU's ability to perform as a credible, significant global actor, and more generally, perhaps, what the pandemic is going to do to the future of multilateralism. Of course, many of us have been saying that multilateralism was perhaps not broken, but certainly under serious stress when the pandemic broke out. And again, the big question here is whether we expect things such as the China-US rivalry to deteriorate multilateralism further, or whether the crisis will actually force countries to come together again and look for new ways of restoring the multilateral system. So without further ado, Ilke, the floor is yours for about 7 or 8 minutes. And by the way, as you all know, you can send in your questions to the following email address, which is actividades@rielcano.org. And I will try and collect as many of your questions as possible and put them to our speakers. So Ilke, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Charles, and good afternoon, everyone.
Microphone.
Yes, I did already unmute myself. So again, I hope you can hear me. Yes?
I can't hear you, Ilke. Are you?
It is unmuted, but Nikolai, Rosa?
Yes, I can hear you. A classic start to any virtual event.
Rosa, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so good. I think I will take it from there anyway. I hope that our director will be able to hear me as well.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Good afternoon, everyone. And it's a pleasure to be here and discussing once again what are the impacts of COVID-19 crisis on Europe. But as we have already said, my main concern is the institutional power reshuffle that might come out of this, the not only inside the European institutions, but also inside the member states and all the competences debate that we have been talking about. Because the COVID-19 crisis has been an unprecedented challenge for the world. This is now clear. And the European Union, being an unfinished integration project with a very high degree of interconnectedness between nation states, was quite slow to respond to it in the beginning. It was criticized very much to lack solidarity, but then it somehow rose to the challenge and started building its European response. But I think for understanding what can and cannot be this European response, we have three dimensions, or at least I will talk about three dimensions today, so that we have a more holistic perspective about judging this European response. The first one is clearly the role and power division between EU institutions. The second of it, the impact of all these divisions on member states related to COVID-19 and not related to COVID-19. And third, and for me, also very important dimension, the interests of the political elites and dynamics of each government. So I think this has not just an institutional dimension at the EU level, but also the party politics and coalition dynamics in each member state has an impact on EU decision making. So for me, these three items and the interconnectedness between them shape this European response that we are looking for. If I start with the institutional dimension, so we have the community institutions versus the intergovernmental institutions. And when we think about this term, it is clear that all these institutions coach this pandemic very much in the beginning of their terms. No, if we can remember, European Commission took office in December, then it was Christmas, and basically in the beginning of March, it was dealing with the biggest crisis since the Second World War. So I think this is the first point that I should make. Then second of all, we have been witnessing a power shift towards the European Council in the 21st century. I will elaborate on this in a couple of minutes, but all these crises that the European Union was going through, be it the constitutional crisis, the euro crisis, migration crisis, Brexit, and now that we are having COVID, so not bad in 20 years, all these existential crises in the EU, the center of gravity recently moved towards European Council. And I think I will be very happy to hear also Nikolai's comments on this, because I know he's also very much thinking about this. This impacted the formation of European Commission as well. This commission, even before the COVID-19, was criticized to be, or judged to be, the most intergovernmental commission. The commissioners were perceived as national commissioners, and there were already questions if this commission was very different from the Juncker Commission. Then when we come to the European Parliament also started this term like with a loss, I would say, because it's lost the battle on Spitzenkandidaten. I'm not going to get into the details on it lost it because of its own behavior or lack of consensus, etc. But it also started with this thinking and talking. This is why I'm sure they're not going to let the debate on a multi-annual financial framework go untouched. I'm sure we should also expect a behavior from them. And when we come to the European Council, as I have already said, it has been already carrying the center of gravity in the European Union. This is clear from the previous crisis, but it's also very important in the COVID-19 pandemic. We have already seen that the European Council met 4 times virtually since the beginning of March, and there will be many other meetings when we think about the European Rescue Fund to come. This connects me to my second point, divisions between member states, because when we have these very vital divisions between member states, an institution like European Council, which generally looks for unanimity, is very much in trouble. Because these divisions, be it COVID-19, for example, there have been thousands daily deaths in the case of Spain, while in Latvia, Cyprus, or Malta, there are not even 1,000 cases in total. There are very grave differences between member states in this pandemic, and if we sum up with all these tensions between the North and South and on the economic dimension, and West and East on the democratic dimension, it is very clear that there are certain divisions that might also affect the functioning of European Council. For me, as a researcher, it was very fascinating, because normally when we're looking about the support for European integration, we look on age, education, income level. No, these are the usual variables to see what is your support level for European integration. But now maybe we should introduce geography, because what you expect from the European Union and what is the perception of competences that you see fit for the European Union very much depends on where you live in the European Union. And the legacy of previous crises very much affect also your perception and expectation from the European Union. And this connects me to my third point. I will try to be brief in the third one. It is not just these countries that matter and their national interests. I think there's a very thin line between national interests and the interests of political elites and governments in power. Because it is, for example, for me, very clear that if we look at the Netherlands or Germany, if they were not in the electoral cycle and if they weren't going to the ballot boxes in 2021, maybe their insistence on pleasing their public opinions wouldn't be exactly on this level. So I think it is also important to understand the national power dynamics in each country, if this is a single party government, if it's a coalition government, if it is supported by other political actors in the country, if there was they were rallying behind their governments in this crisis, or if they were mainly facing opposition or party competition, also politicizing COVID-19. So these party politics and government dynamics in each member state play into the dynamics related to member states, and these dynamics play into the institutional setup of the European Union. So when we are talking, to sum up, if I would like to leave it here, if we want to understand what European response is and how it has been built until now and what will it become when we are dealing with the economic crisis, it is very important to understand the institutional power dynamics, the member state dynamics and their differences, and all the challenges that the national governments face in the national level that will shape also their behavior in other institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ilke, for kicking that off. And I think it's a very useful way of trying to understand this, and trying to group this into three sort of different levels. Maybe we can go back later, or Nikolai may touch a little bit on an institution you didn't mention. I'm thinking a bit in terms of winners and losers, at the European level. And of course, for obvious reasons, the European Central Bank has been very much on our minds and on our television screens. It's probably the most visible of all the European institutions, as was, of course, also true during the financial crisis. And maybe we can go back to this when we talk about Germany in particular. Secondly, yes, as you say, we're bringing geography back in to our debates. And of course, it's not just, as you were saying, not just the North-South tensions, which already existed, but also the East-West tensions. Borrell, whom I mentioned earlier in his rather long essay about the future already being here with us, pointed out that Central and Eastern European countries have really not been significantly hurt by the crisis to date, and therefore that perhaps, when we think of reshoring some of our industrial or economic activity, perhaps the Central and Eastern European states will be the biggest beneficiaries, unexpectedly perhaps, of the crisis. By the way, I think we can now say that every major Western European state has been almost equally affected. Italy, France, Spain, but interestingly, for example, not Portugal. So, even the north, south, east, west division has certain exceptions. And then finally, very interesting what you're saying about the internal dimension. Of course, here in Spain, we're paying quite a lot of attention to that because for the first time in history, we have a coalition government, of course, and it'll be interesting to see how the future of the coalition government is affected by this, but also one could even take it down another level in federal states, the centrifugal and centripetal forces that are at play here. It's very interesting in semi-federal states like Spain, how the crisis is also playing into the political dynamics. So thank you for that. So Nikolai, as far as I'm hoping you will pick up on the question of the crisis that the German Constitutional Court ruling may have triggered. But let's hear you on the German presidency then, that's going to save us yet again.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Elcano, for organizing this and inviting me. I think one of the very, very few benefits of this crisis is that it has made it much more easily available to organize these kind of roundtables with experts from across Europe, so that we can have more exchange than we used to. And I'm happy to give my points and the view from Berlin on the question what's up next. On the EU agenda in the response to COVID-19, how the German presidency means to deal with that, and what that also means to some extent for the Conference on the Future of Europe. I'll only do a very, very short comment on the judgment of the Constitutional Court at the end, which certainly hasn't made the life of the German presidency easier, as it also complicates German European policy. But first, the general point, what's now up ahead. I think Ilke already said that the EU was slow to respond to the coronavirus crisis. It was in a paralysis early on, but we are now in the stage where the EU institutions have acted in several of these emergency summits. Most of the EU member states have been able to flatten the curve, so to speak. So the question is now, what are the more midterm and long-term measures for the EU to take? And I would structure them maybe in three levels, which I think the EU will need to tackle. The first is coordination. If you think about what needs to be done to contain the coronavirus and also kickstart the economies, a lot of the measures are in national competences or even in regional competences. And this was one of the challenges of the EU early on, that most of the competences necessary to deal directly with the crisis, like the lockdown measures, like the early economic responses, are only in the national competences. And here the big challenge of the EU is to really coordinate between the member states and try to get as much as possible a common response also on questions like easing some of the lockdown measures, question on reopening borders. Yesterday, we saw a new recommendation by the European Commission on how to deal with tourism and traveling once the tourism season starts in summer. So all of these are really questions where the EU cannot dictate anything to the member states. In Germany, even the federal government can't dictate it, but it's much more around coordination and trying to get as much as possible so that the EU member states work in lockstep. Second area of EU activity, I would cluster around protecting the EU course achievement. First and foremost, the single market. And I think the coronavirus was almost a perfect target for the EU single market. It led to member states closing their borders to goods, to people. Some, like Germany and France, even made export bans on medical equipment early on. And I think here it's really something where even the core of the European Union is under threat. And the EU will need to work as soon as possible on trying to protect the core of its functioning. It has been successful in reining in member states like Germany and France to lift the export bans within the European Union, and it now has to work on trying to reopening borders, not only for goods, and which has already partly been achieved, but first and foremost for people, at least there where it's admissible on the level of the spread of the virus. And then the third cluster, and I think this is the most problematic one between the member states, is the case of distribution. And the distribution of the economic response to the coronavirus crisis. The coronavirus started like an external shock, but a symmetric external shock, popping up in almost all EU member states. But as Ilke said, the level of the coronavirus hit is quite significantly different in the EU member states, but also their capacity to respond economically is very different, with countries like Germany, who had a fiscal surplus for a long time, was able to implement a much bigger economic response program, like some of the countries which had austerity programs for a long, long time. And we already seen by the economic forecast from the European Commission that there are expected to be much worse hits in countries like Spain, Italy, but also Greece, while countries like Germany and the Netherlands, Denmark are expected to recover earlier than Southern European countries. And therefore, I think a prime task of the EU will be to find a joint response to these economic challenges. And this really brings us to the question of distribution, of trying to get joint economic facilities where the EU can help those member states who are more strongly affected or are longer affected. And this, of course, really reinforces the North-South divides. We had really early on the debate about Eurobonds and how to create what is called fiscal solidarity within the EU to enable it to respond jointly. And here, I would say, sort of to report from the discussion in Germany, there's a really interesting discussion of an acknowledgement that in an enlightened self-interest, even countries like Germany who are less affected are really it's really necessary for us to help other European countries and to respond to this challenge together. But at the same time, there is still a strong reluctance to full out instruments of mutualization like Eurobonds. And the middle ground that the German government now tries to find is to acknowledge that we need a higher European budget and to develop a recovering fund through the European budget, where it's acknowledged that Germany needs to pay more into the budget and that this should be used to support those countries who are more strongly affected and to organize a recovery together. But even on this general level, we have now agreement on and the European Union, but the devil, as always, is in the details. How big should the additional budget should be? Should it compromise mostly out of loans, like some argue in Germany, or should it be grants, where other member states redistribute the money via the European budget? And so a lot of the really, really difficult questions that always surround the EU long-term budget, which is amongst the most vicious negotiations on the European level, will now have to be conducted in a really short time to really turn that into a recovery fund that can do more than just declaratory solidarity within the EU. And this, I think, the distributive element is the politically most toxic ones. And this brings me to the German presidency, which is my second major point. As you said, Charles, in the beginning, the German presidency initially, I would say, was almost lackluster. It was planned to be a presidency at the early start of the von der Leyen Commission, where there was some legislative instruments like the Green Deal. There was a China summit planned, but really a presidency that was supposed to be at the end of the long chancellorship of of Chancellor Merkel, where Germany was a good European citizen and tries to, as best as possible, get through the legislative agenda, but not really bring forward a big push for European integration. Now Germany suddenly has the responsibility to lead during a time where Europe is really at a precipice. and there are strong expectations that Germany can contribute to the European Union getting out of this crisis stronger. And there's almost an interesting mirror image. The last German presidency was in 2007. It was at the beginning of Angela Merkel's chancellorship. It was right after the constitutional treaty was rejected in France and the Netherlands, and it was Merkel's first big moment on the European scene, where she was able to put European integration on a new track and negotiate the Lisbon Treaty. And now the expectations are quite high again, that basically at the end of her 16 years as Chancellor, she manages again to put European integration on a new footing. And therefore, Germany really has to reorganize its whole presidency. And what we're hearing in Berlin is that the government wants to reorganize the priorities in the next 6 months completely. And there are basically 3 levels of priorities. The first level is the direct response to the coronavirus. So everything that I've mentioned in the coordination of exit measures, the lockdown measures, trying to reopening the borders, but also Germany very much stresses the economic and social response to the secondary effects of the coronavirus. The second level of priorities are processes that cannot wait until 2021. So that's the MFF, the multi-annual financial framework, first and foremost, but also Brexit, if the United Kingdom doesn't give us the favor of extending the transition period. And only then comes the third layer of priorities, which is everything else, where Germany and the other EU member states will need to see what is even possible under the limited Zoom diplomacy, let's put it this way, where the EU's capacities to negotiate are much more limited, where Germany is downplaying the expectations for the Green Deal, they're downplaying the expectations for the China summit, and they're downplaying the expectations for other areas like rule of law, digitalization, and so on. And if we really put sort of the focus on it, what is the one thing that Germany's presidency will be measured upon? That really is completing the multi-annual financial framework. And this really connects the first 2 points. Germany is the biggest net payer into the EU budget, has now the presidency for the next six months. And really the major task will be to upgrade the multi-annual financial framework. And if we look at the failed negotiations in February, their member states really struggled around 0.1%. And even under Brexit, the expectation was that the MFF wouldn't really shift a lot. And now suddenly with the COVID-19 crisis, there's the demand from all sides to really turn up and fundamentally change the 7-year budget for the EU. And I think this will really be the point that the German presidency will be judged upon, and where Germany will try to find a balance from saying, yes, we're willing to pay more, but we have our own taxpayers and we will get much less tax in Germany as well. And we need to be a neutral broker as a presidency to find a compromise. And bringing these 3 different strands together will really be, I would say, the biggest test of Angela Merkel's skill in this presidency of trying to bring the member states together. This brings me to my last point, the long-term task for the European Union and the Conference on the Future of Europe, which was also planned to start, I think, last week on the 9th of May, but really to kickstart during the German presidency. This, as almost everything else, has been postponed. We haven't had the start now. We don't even have the fundamental agreement yet between the European Parliament and the Council what shape this Conference on the Future of Europe should be. But my impression early on this year was that expectations were gradually being downplayed from something that Commission President von der Leyen promised as an opportunity to also look at the treaties and the fundamental structures of the EU. It was more and more being downplayed as something that was more a sort of extensive citizen consultation mechanism. And I think now we see that after the financial crisis, the migration crisis, the coronavirus is the 3rd time an external shock came upon the EU. And Ulke said in the beginning, the EU as an unfinished integration project. And this external shock again turned into a crisis of the European Union and the European construct. And therefore, I think we also need to increase our ambitions for that conference on the future of Europe, and really think about how the European Union needs to be restructured in the future to be more resilient to these kind of external shocks. And therefore, I think there will be much more consultations during the German presidency, whether and how to upgrade this conference on the future of Europe from something that was in danger of turning only into a sort of proto-citizen consultation exercise, in again a moment where we can rethink the European construct and to think about what kind of competences the EU should have in health policy, for instance, and where there should be more majority voting to really enable the EU to respond more effectively to these kind of external shocks in the future. And I look forward to the questions and discussing that and putting all these pieces together. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Nikolai. And you were making a very good point, of course, in the literature. We've often been reminded that when it comes to negotiating the budget, it's very often, historically, it has very often been better when perhaps smaller member states could act as neutral power brokers. And here, of course, we have exactly the opposite. We have a German presidency which will have to deal, as you were saying, with some very, very tough decisions. And also, of course, towards the end of Angela Merkel's chancellorship, which again is perhaps, it's elegant in terms of poetic justice, of course, because this presidency will bracket her time in office. And you're quite right to remind us of the 2007 presidency, but of course, a lot of people, both in Germany and elsewhere, will feel that perhaps this could have come at a better time, both for the Chancellor and for the rest of Europe. Rosa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'll move to a slightly more international perspective on this. What I'd like to start from is just identifying some three major trends that have been, by and large, accelerated by the coronavirus, but perhaps there still are some unknowns there. And what does this mean for Europe? And then perhaps afterwards we can make bigger connections between the internal analysis of what's happening inside the EU and how that has a more direct consequence on the EU's ability to carry out foreign policy. So the three major trends that I'm thinking about, there's obviously a lot of discussion, and we're all rushing to produce commentary on, how coronavirus changes things. So, with these many ideas that are being put out, I think there are three major trends that we need to look at. The first is the obvious deterioration of the relationship between US and China. In fact, I shouldn't even call it a relationship, it's rivalry. The second is how the coronavirus will impact the global south as a very broad concept, but basically other geopolitical realities elsewhere, and how that will relate back to global leadership. And the third, which I think is global, but I'm interested more in the European component, the impact of the economic recession and on the ability to carry out foreign policy. So the first one, let's just look at the US-China rivalry. It has been deteriorating seriously. It was already in a very bad place. My colleagues working on US-China relations have underlined that in the past, in every single crisis from 9/11 to the financial crisis, however bad the relationship was between the US and China, they would still talk to each other. This is not happening at the moment. And the consequence of this is, rather than the sort of G2 world, it's a G- world, as someone has said, or anarchy, as Kevin Rudd wrote the other day. In any case, it's fragmentation. This is causing the rest of the world to be fragmented. And I think the failure of the Antonio Guterres's call for a ceasefire on peace at the UN, because of the US-China rivalry, is just an example of that kind of fragmentation. This has several implications. The first, with respect to Europe, of course, the first is that that Europe is one of the turf territories for this battle. Both the US and China are demanding black and white responses from European EU member states, from European states, and we know that the member states are not on the same page. It's another perhaps potential fracture within the EU, and it's very difficult to reach a common position. I actually think that the Chinese mask diplomacy has backlashed, and I think there's greater suspicion of Chinese motivations in Europe. I've seen, well, I haven't seen the reports, but there've been news of reports from MI5, MI6, you know, to be cautious of Chinese investments. Sweden has introduced screening of foreign investments. The EU has been doing the same. So there is a trend towards a greater suspicion towards China. But of course, there's the question mark of what's going to happen in the US with the presidential elections. So we're seeing both those dynamics playing up, and it's very difficult for the EU to seize what perhaps potentially is the opportunity that through this rivalry and lack of global leadership, there is some space that Europe can occupy, maybe a small space, but to provide some idea of an alternative, even if it is not necessarily a strong alternative, to build up its own ambitions for strategic autonomy, or to provide perhaps a bridge between warring, fighting partners, fighting rivals, excuse me. Of course, if we look at the multilateral dimension, this is very difficult. Maybe we can return to this afterwards, because obviously US-China are deliberately undermining the international order and the individual institutions. Either they're undermining it or they're hijacking them. So that both dynamics are being carried out. But we can elaborate further on this, but let me just move on to the second big trend, which I suppose there's some unknowns here, but I think they have huge implications for Europe. So how the coronavirus will impact the global south and other geopolitical realities, in many cases we actually don't know yet, because the trend of the virus has potentially not developed as much as it has in the north. I was looking at the Johns Hopkins coronavirus tracker. So ironically, Romania and Indonesia came up at in the same list, because they have the same number of cases, right? So there's a huge gap between the numbers in parts of the south, of the global south, and in the north of the world. Obviously, it could also be, it might not just be that the virus hasn't arrived, it might just be that past pandemics, resilience of the population, there could be all sorts of reasons for which maybe this will not explode. However, we've had plenty of warnings, especially from the African continent, on the potential devastating impact of coronavirus. There have been talk of the lost generation. All the UN agencies have been issuing warnings about levels of poverty that we had thought we had eradicated, famine, hunger. So this will be hugely difficult, and without visible leadership in the north of the globe that is going to take responsibility for this. There are, of course, other potential aspects. Again, as I said, this is a little bit more in the unknown sphere, but there are other potential implications. If the global south is indeed showing a greater resilience, it could be part of a conversation for what will the post-pandemic world look like. If we are moving towards an oil-free world, the whole geopolitics of the Middle East will change. So there are all sorts of other potential shifts there. And we don't really know where Europe is going to be, where Europe can play a role, but there could be some opportunities as well as some huge challenges. But it seems clear to me that, at least insofar as Africa is concerned, European states will have to take responsibility, because the US sees Africa purely through the prism of security and/or humanitarian, and China doesn't seem to be willing to provide the next Marshall Plan for Africa. So these will have huge implications, I think, on Europe, and will touch the nerve of very difficult issues in European foreign policy. I'm thinking in particular migration patterns. Third trend is the economic recession, the impacts of the economic recession. This is a global debate. There are those talking about deglobalization or a complete restructuring of the international economy. I would just like to focus on Europe and on the international dimensions. And the first is related to the point above. So who's going to pay even for the sort of humanitarian and development portfolios that the EU has been carrying out since, Europe and the EU since the 1950s without that much controversy? Who's going to be paying for it if the recession hits Europe hard and taxpayers will be asked to make choices? Similarly, on all sorts of other issues that are related to security, defense, and foreign policy. Obviously, security and defense budget is the one that at the moment seems to be at greater risk of cuts in the next MFF. And then what will happen to the overarching goals that the EU has been pushing and pioneering, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, which are conducted in a multilateral framework, or the climate crisis goals? How will that influence EU ability to carry out foreign policy externally? So these are the sort of these are some of the direct external potential negatives of the economic recession. But I think we also need to think a little bit more about how the economic recession will shift the debate inside Europe. So leaving aside the sort of traditional goals of foreign policy, how is the economic recession going to change the internal debate about Europe's global role? We've seen that in most countries at the moment, the poll ratings of most governments are fairly positive, but it's also argued that this is physiological, and therefore we should not assume that populism will not be returning. I think this phase now of easing the lockdown is going to be particularly sensitive for most governments, and some may not be re-elected on the basis of what happens in the coming weeks and months. The trend towards migration, fortress Europe, and a closure towards migration hasn't gone away. We're just having some respite in terms of numbers, but Turkey's always there pushing threats. These spats on the Greek-Turkish border continue. So all that debate has been temporarily frozen. There is discussion. The Commission is due to present some proposals on migration policy imminently, but we have no indication that member states have significantly changed their position, and it's not clear whether coronavirus would in any way change that. Another point which I think is interesting, which again, this can have positive and negative angles, is that the coronavirus pandemic exposed the fragility of Europe in terms of supply chains on pretty basic issues like masks, face masks, and pharmaceuticals. And now all of a sudden, face masks have become, the production of face masks has become part of the strategic industry. What impacts might that have on trade preferences, on what countries we want to work with to change the supply chain, and similarly with respect to the green economy? So if the coronavirus leads to an upgraded investment into the green economy or not, I mean, both things could happen. Again, we have choices need to be made. What does that mean in terms of the international relations of a green economy? What kind of trade deals will the EU be seeking? What kind of partners will it be seeking? And I think here there could be some changes, some differences in what has happened so far. So looking at it from this perspective, there are huge complications. There also are some opportunities for the EU to find different niches and to design foreign policy differently. And I would sort of sum it up, I suppose, and then we can move on maybe to some question and comments, in the sense that one of the big opportunities perhaps is for the European Union in a context in which it is increasingly squeezed by the US-China rivalry, in which unrest, civil and political unrest has not has not been subsided by the coronavirus, maybe the goal needs to be to reach out to a broader and more diverse range of friends and partners. And I'm not just thinking about countries, I'm also thinking about civil society organizations, so that at least some of its priorities can be pursued, even if the general international context at the moment is actually quite hostile. I think the EU and Europe has a lot to offer to countries and civil society outside Europe. So it needs to find those niches in which it can carry out a different narrative to the divisive narrative and nationalist narrative that the US-China rivalry at the moment is promoting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosa. So we have some interesting questions coming in, which I will try to group as sensibly as I can. So if I can start with Ilke, since she has been quiet and patient. A couple of easy ones for you, Ilke. People are very obviously, there's a narrative in the media, you know, that to the effect that this is either going to, that the pandemic will either make the EU or break the EU. Where do we stand on this? But more to the point, perhaps, in connection with some of the things that you were discussing, is it credible, is it plausible to expect the European Union to advance in the direction of deeper integration towards what we conventionally, well, and the treaties describe as ever closer union, in response to the obvious shortcomings, or some of the possible shortcomings of the EU's reaction to the pandemic? Or do we expect exactly the opposite, retrenchment, more protectionism, less internal cohesion, as we were saying, north, south, east, west, debtor-creditor, which is, of course, has been aggravated by this remarkably asymmetrical impact of what was, if you like, a symmetrical shock originally. So, Ilke.
Thank you very much. Actually, I would like to start with the second one that you have asked, because I think if we can go, if this will make it or break it, for me it's make it. I think I'm very positive there, and I will get back to that. But the second question, if we can go towards deeper integration, what will happen with the internal cohesion of the EU? I think it is very much connecting back to what I have been saying in my primary intervention. Because at the end of the day, the European Union is an entity that comes from the competences and the desires that were given to it. So what the citizens think, what the political elite think, will very much define what will be the future. Of course, what the dimensions that Rosa were already defining related to the external dimensions are equally important. But if we just look back into the internal dynamics of the Union, this will very much depend on how it will be shaped in the future. I would like to underline one trend, or at least I hope it is a trend, during the COVID-19 crisis. For me, there was a different Europeanization of the public space, national public space, beyond blame shifting, usual blame shifting of national governments. Like, let's take the example of Spain. Now, Spain has been always a pro-European country. It is, for some, even a naive pro-European country. But in general, we have seen a permissive consensus on the European Union. This time we are seeing a Europeanization of public space that required, for example, von der Leyen being on primetime television, Charles Michel the same, Sassoli connecting to that, Pedro Sanchez writing various language op-eds in different newspapers, so trying to convince their public opinions, and always underlining this message of we are in this ship together. This is not just necessarily for me the blame shifting dimension of it, but underlying the importance of the role of the European in this COVID-19 crisis. This is a crisis that some of these countries, including Spain, Italy, and also others, that cannot go out of it alone. So I think this may create some sense of togetherness, like togetherness in bad days, that might give an opportunity to rethink and rediscuss all these competences. About the question related to cohesion, I think the divisions inside the European Union are quite visible and important, and definitely require treatment. Personally, I have been a supporter of multi-speed Europe. So thinking about structures that can advance in some areas for the ones that would like to advance, and for the ones that are not necessarily willing to do so, kind of keeping them out. This has been the case with the Euro. This has been the case with the Schengen area. I think if we want a realistic goal for the future, different like multi-speed moves towards the future should be thought very much in detail, and I think this might also have answers to these trends on the nationalists and populists. If you let me to contribute one more sentence, because I really wanted to say that also in my primary intervention, there is a gap between policies that will enforce the EU and what will be politically beneficial for the ones that are at office. And this gap is very much shaping the decisions of the political elite. No, that's like what will enforce the EU, what will deepen integration, not necessarily is the best for these political elites at home. So as long as this gap exists, the best way that the political elites are looking for are hiding behind the public opinion dimension, while crises require not hiding behind the public opinion, but public opinion shaping. For example, I value the article of the president of the German president very much. Like, this is a time for not just solidarity, for shaping and building the future of the European Union. So I think this is a reality that we should put on the table. The rise of nationalisms, the rise of populism, or like limiting the project and more protectionism also very much depend on the elites' attitudes on the national level, on the European level, and very much also depends, of course, the citizens asking for further integration or not. But how we can involve them further, how we can make them more also loyal to the project is another question that I will be happy to answer if there's a question about that.
Thank you very much. Nikolai, and maybe I'll ask all of you later about the conference on the future of Europe, Ilke, and so you can insert your thoughts in that context. We have a Spanish audience here, Nikolai, not exclusively, so they're not going to let you off the hook so easily. Yes, everyone is very fond of your federal president, and it's very nice of him to say, that if only because of enlightened self-interest, Germans should realize that we're in this together, and that even countries which are in a better position to help their national economies because they are less indebted, etc. Even they understand that unless countries like France and Italy and Spain also recover in a reasonably successful manner, then the internal market and of course the Eurozone will be in trouble. So, okay, having said that, the question is, first of all, how do you see the ongoing debate, the sort of loans versus transfers debate developing in the short term? I think practically everyone would agree that debt mutualization is off the table. It's not going to happen this time round either. I don't know how many crises it will take for this to happen, if it ever does actually come about. But how do you see this playing out? Secondly, and directly related to that, how do you see the next budget? What kind of shape and size do you think the next budget will finally adopt? And just one final question, since someone out there knows that you're a Brexit man, or rather a Brexit expert. I'm not suggesting that you're a Brexiteer by any means. The question is, how will the German presidency handle the Brexit issue? Since, of course, if there is a no deal Brexit, ultimately this would also happen under Germany's watch, or under the watch of the German presidency. The floor is yours.
I was muted, so thank you very much for the question. So the ongoing debate between loans and grants in Germany about fiscal responsibility and solidarity within the EU. I think it's important to highlight that the debate in Germany has become more differentiated, but not completely tipped. So I would say during the Eurozone crisis, there was almost anonymity amongst German economists and the German public, who rightly or wrongly put most of the blame for the rising debt level and for the financial difficulties of countries like Greece, Portugal, but also to some extent Spain, Italy, and Ireland. They put it mostly the blame on these countries themselves. And the narrative in Germany was these countries need to do their homework, and we need to tighten the fiscal rules in the European Union, and the Eurozone can only survive if we come back to the Maastricht principle that countries are responsible for their own fiscal space, and only then the Euro can function. And if Germany and other Nordic countries create mutualization of debt, that would create the wrong incentives for these countries. And that narrative is changing. So there is a clear acknowledgement that this is an external shock that has hit countries across Europe and across the world, and that this is particularly devastating for countries with a limited fiscal space to compensate that. And therefore, the narrative is no longer the blame is with these countries, but we need to find a way to gather out of this, and that the EU needs to support all of its member states to come out of that together. And therefore, there were even a group of German economists who have been publicly calling for Eurobonds, whereas the government, as you know, is still very, very reluctant. We had this week the BDI, the German Federation of Industries, with a joint paper with their French and Italian counterpart calling for fiscal solidarity within the EU. And so there are more and more voices, even in the German scene, who are saying no to Eurobonds. We cannot create eternal mutualization of debt. But for this specific situation, we need to find a European instrument that can support all the countries, and that we need to find a balance between, and this is the public statement or speaking rule, I would say at the moment, a balance between grants and loans. And so I can see the German government being open to a significantly higher EU budget, significantly higher German net payment into that budget, and a mixture between grants and loans. How that mixture exactly plays out will depend a lot on the details, how that money needs to be spent, what are the conditions, who will in effect be in control of these, will it be the European Commission or only the member states, what will be the necessary conditions for co-financing on the national level. But I would say the German position is shifting, not through outright support of instruments like Eurobonds, but certainly more towards more joint instruments. And I would say more to an understanding that this is a crisis that needs a common response, where the blame for the fiscal deficits on the national level are no longer exclusively with the member states. But you still will have German economic professors who mention in debates, but what about the old debts of Italy? We cannot make the German taxpayers pay for all of the, let's say, debts of the past. So it's not a completely changed debate, but something which is shifting, and where Angela Merkel herself has been very forefront, also in the Bundestag and within her party, saying that Germany needs to be willing to pay more. And so the 100 million euro question, or billion euro question, so to say, is the one on what shape or form will the next budget take. I'm not enough of a budget expert to say I can give you a specific number. My impression is that the EU budget used to have a very strong past dependency. with very limited shifts between the different parts of the EU budget, agriculture, cohesion, and so on. And this now suddenly is a singular moment in the EU history where suddenly a lot of things are possible about changing the structure of the EU budget, the overall shape, and where we are no longer talking about 0.1% of shifts, but suddenly about percent points of shifts in the budget. And so what I can say only politically is that we need really a fundamental rethink of the budget, and that will only be possible with a summit in person. And what we really need to have, again, is EU leaders in the room, sitting in front of each other in smaller groups, looking themselves into the eye and trying to broker out the compromises that are necessary between the different groups in these debates, the ambitious Europe, the frugal four, the South, the North. And so I really think what we fundamentally need in June, again, is a meeting in person of the leaders to negotiate this out. And as we say in Brussels, have another night of the long knives where everybody fights for their corner, that at the end there's a compromise that everybody can live with. Finally, how will the German presidency handle Brexit? I would say the real answer is as little as possible. So far, the EU has been quite successful in saying the Brexit negotiations should be handled by the Commission and not by the member states. The UK, remember David Davis, who early on said our first call should be to Berlin and Paris. And Chancellor Merkel said, no, we won't negotiate bilaterally with the UK. And I think the worst Germany could do now would be to say, okay, we have a meeting between Merkel and Johnson, and there they negotiate the Brexit deal. I think all other EU countries would rightfully be quite suspicious of what comes out of that. And so I think the best Germany can do during its presidency would be, regardless on how the UK asks, say, our negotiator is Michel Barnier. We as German presidency will do everything to keep the unity of the 27 in these more difficult negotiations and prepare ourselves for all eventuality. But keep itself out of the Brexit negotiations, which I think the EU is more successful in if it does it unified and if it does it by its unified actors rather than the German presidency, even if by happenstance it leads the council in this very special moment.
Thank you very much. It probably doesn't surprise you or won't surprise you to learn that according to the polls that we ourselves carry out at Elcano every 6 months or so, Angela Merkel remains the most popular European leader in Spain, which she has been ever since she came to office. One interesting thing, though, that did change in the latest poll that we published in April is that for the first time in the 20 years or so that we've been doing this, when Spaniards are asked which EU member state is your partner of choice, the answer has always been Germany. And for the first time in April, March, April, the answer was France. I think this is a blip. It's a hiccup. I'm pretty confident that it will go back to being Germany. But obviously it did reflect the point in time when the field work was being carried out. This was at the height of the Dutch, some rather unfortunate remarks by the Dutch finance minister, when the whole question of moral hazard reared its ugly head yet again and was strongly reminiscent of the 2010 debate. But it's interesting how, as Ilke was saying, Spain remains staunchly Europeanist, but also nobody here has really been particularly critical of the EU's response. Partly, I suppose, because people understand that health is a national competence or indeed a regional competence, as is the case in Germany, but also because most of the criticism, for better or for worse, has actually been directed internally towards the Spanish authorities at whichever level they were involved. So Rosa, if I can turn to you, your G- remark has attracted people's attention. Of course, people have a sort of a journalistic view of these things, or perhaps it's the influence of football and other popular sports. who are the winners and the losers is one of the questions, or several of the questions that I'm getting. In other words, from what you've said, one could perhaps conclude that China, although most studies suggest that the Chinese economy will fare slightly better than the US economy or the European economies, by Chinese standards, it's still a pretty awful scenario. Growth of only, I think, 1.5% this year is the IMF estimate. So to claim that this is going to be a Chinese victory is difficult. As you were saying, Chinese public diplomacy, if we can still actually call it that, hasn't been terribly well received, I think, anywhere in the world. And interestingly, they seem to be following Russian models in some cases when it comes to disinformation practices. And obviously the US is in disarray. So as you were saying, possibly there is a potential opportunity, a window of opportunity here for Europe to act either as a bridge or perhaps as a mediator. What about, one of the questions is, apart from the winners or losers questions, what about the chances of this leading to a revamped multilateral system? People have obviously seen that the WHO is much weaker than it needs to be, but is it realistic to expect institutions, well, in particular the WHO, but perhaps other United Nations institutions to emerge from this stronger than they were originally? And the second question people are asking is, of course, the geopolitical commission business. Some people probably felt at the time that the commission president was being overly ambitious when she described this new commission as a geopolitical commission without really defining exactly what she meant by that. In a sense, the pandemic has handed her a leitmotif on a platter. The question people are asking is, will she deliver, or will this commission actually be able to deliver? So two separate questions there.
Yeah, let's start with the multilateralism piece. I mean, in the short term, I cannot say that I'm optimistic. As I alluded to in my initial remarks, so that, you know, the United States is deliberately undermining multilateralism and has been doing so quite effectively for the past 4 years. Obviously, if there's a change of leadership, and that's an ideological position, it's not just because they don't want to have scrutiny. It's an ideological position. This administration is actively against multilateralism and its institutions. So they've been actively undermining it, and obviously now doing it with the WHO, which offers, evidently in the eyes of the administration, one of the many scapegoats for the fact that the handling of the coronavirus pandemic in the US is not going very well. China has been, conversely, portraying itself as a country that signs up to multilateralism, but very much on its own terms. And indeed, this is obvious with, again, WHO, and how the relationship between WHO and China has been tarnished by accusations, some of which seem to be quite credible. And of course, more importantly, how China, for instance, excluded Taiwan, deliberately has worked to exclude Taiwan from the WHO. So the actual structure of the organization has been influenced by China's individual geopolitical goals. So I think in the short term, it's hard to see that. But there are many more countries who do want WHO to be strengthened and reformed. I mean, it's not a question simply of strengthening WHO or other international organizations as they are. What they require is reform. And I think there are also plenty of countries that have been wanting this reform and have been, many of which have been distrustful of international organizations, because that was where the sort of Western hegemony was carried through. So I think there are, at this point in time, opportunities for the EU, its member states, and other like-minded countries to try and build coalitions to prepare for the reform of the multilateral system or some of the organizations. And this, after November, this might have a new momentum. And I think there's a lot more support for this in public opinion. One of the sideline effects of coronavirus is that all of a sudden expertise is actually valued after a decade of being brushed under the carpet by populists. All of a sudden it's actually valued. I hope this will last. Of course, even in science, it is obvious to the general public that there's no black and white answer, and there's no mathematical answer to the big challenges. And this is obvious also in science, not just in the human sciences. But I still think this push will be there. And I think also it will be necessary to use some international organizations or groupings to address some of the problems. And we've already seen, debt relief being dealt with at G7, G20 levels. This will have to, there'll be some activity. So let's not herald the end of the multilateral system. Let's think that perhaps this is a time for building coalitions to reform them once the maybe the tensions have been diffused, because at the moment we're at a very heightened moment of tension with the two greatest powers being on different sides of the equation. But it can't be the multilateralist vision of China. I mean, it has to be something different from that. On the geopolitical commission, this is I mean, personally, I kind of suspect it was not thought through as a sort of brand for the commission. I think it's you kind of see that there's an oxymoron of the commission being geopolitical. It just doesn't seem to work. Even for the EU, it struggles to work when it's so divided. You expect the geopolitical actor to have a single head, to be focused on single objectives, and of course the EU is none of that. But I do think that the EU has an opportunity to, and the power, actually, the potential power to use some of its assets in less of a technocratic and regulatory way and more as an instrument of foreign policy. And I'm thinking in particular of trade, regulation, data. There are all sorts of areas where the EU is a power. I mean, it still is the largest market in the world. Even after Brexit, it will be the largest market in the world. So for me, the question is how to do it. I think it's capable. From my point of view, how the previous commission handled the trade spat with the US was actually pretty smart. And coming from not just a political commission at that time, and it worked. I mean, one could argue it works because the US-China thing distracted US attention from Europe, but it worked. So there are things that can be done by leveraging economic tools mostly. There was a communication about a year and a half now ago on leveraging on the international role of the euro. I think that debate is still at its early stages, but there are opportunities there as well. So the question that then one can raise is, how can the EU reconcile its global ambitions to be an actor working towards supporting multilateralism, while at the same time it's using its geoeconomic tools in a rather more realist way? So that's where that tension emerges. It need not be there, that tension, but at the moment, a lot of the rhetoric has focused on either one or the other. We support multilateralism, or we need to be more geopolitical. And I think there's space in between there, but that space needs to be filled with real policy. And at the moment, we're not seeing much of that, largely because everything has been hijacked by the dealing with the coronavirus and the implications of the coronavirus. I think most people in the institutions are working just on that, how to adapt their daily routine and their policy to the current realities. But I think there's space in between. Did you also mention the strategic autonomy question, or
no? No. Let me then just, we're running out of time. That last point you made is very good. I mean, do we want to be do we still want to be regarded as a normative power, and how do you make that compatible with learning how to speak the language of power, as Borrell put it recently? Let me just ask all of you, since we're running out of time, for a very quick answer to a simple question, which is, as you know, the Conference on the Future of Europe should have started on Europe Day, May 2020. It's going to be postponed until September. What, in your view, should the main thrust of this conference on the future of Europe be in the light of the pandemic? Before the pandemic, I think a lot of people were worried that we would get sort of bogged down in the usual fascinating debates for academics, but rather boring and irrelevant for most other people about institutions and procedures and so on, and voting patterns and whatnot. Do you think the pandemic has actually saved the Conference on the Future of Europe? There's a Spanish paper or non-paper you may know, which is basically arguing that the conference should concentrate on Europe and the world, or how Europe sees the world. So over to you, Ilke, first. And I have to ask you to be very brief, I'm afraid. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think, as Nikolai has already said, the COVID-19 pandemic made the Conference on the Future of Europe even more important. And for me, there are two dimensions that should be put into its center, or it should at least take some important role in this discussion. The first one is related to all the power dynamics I was describing. I think understanding and discussing and rethinking this power dynamics between member state governments, the interests, the national interests, and the EU institutions is a very core dimension of the decision-making process and the future, and the ability to handle future crises. Because this crisis showed me, and showed to many, which was said like the judged being a solidarity crisis in the beginning, turned out to be, even if the EU institutions wanted to make something a reality, it was not necessarily so easy to do. So I think all this power reshuffle and competences and voting behavior inside the institutions, the requirement of unanimity, etc., etc., I'm not going to be so long in there, should be rethought in the conference. And in addition to that, as a second dynamic, as Rosa very well summarized, the EU is supposed to play a role if it would like to reform multilateral institutions. No, because we are seeing that White House is not willing to play that role. It has a very big rival to deal with. And even if it's Trump or another or Biden that will come out from the election in November, the attitude towards these institutions could be similar. At least the attitude towards solving problems of Europe could be similar. Of course, Biden would make things easier. So if the European Union would like to play this role outside, it should definitely clarify its head, strengthen its institutions, and turn its attention towards how to reform these multilateral institutions using its leverages in economy. I very much agree, and Rosa, I'm sure she will elaborate on that. But I think these two dimensions, internal power politics and external usage of this reinforced power in external dynamics, should be in the center of the Conference on the Future of Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Nikolai.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think really it should be used to re-upgrade the Conference of Europe. There was a danger that the conference would turn into a PR exercise where the member states basically excluded every interesting questions, no treaty change, no direct discussion of legislation. And I think what the pandemic has shown us, that the EU as an unfinished integration project has really difficult issues still at its core that need to be solved. And I didn't answer your question on the German judgment of the Constitutional Court, but that again put the highlight on some of the unanswered questions about the structure of the Eurozone. And I think there's really a necessity to look at the treaties again and to look at the competences of the EU again. And so I hope it can be used as an opportunity to get ownership of the member states, to talk about the structural issues of the member states of the EU, and then tackle them together in this long-term framework, rather than this PR exercise where it's of course good to involve the citizens, but we also need to involve the member states and together get the will to tackle the structural deficits of the EU again.
Thank you, Rosa. And perhaps before you answer, I just want to mention a couple of people had raised Africa. You did as well, of course, but some people are asking us how credible is the EU when our reaction to the problems that Africa and our southern neighborhood basically are going to face is a 15 billion euro package, which is peanuts basically. Why don't we think about more substantial things like, given that we're going to have shorter value chains, and perhaps, we should think of shorter supply chains, in particular, shifting some of the production of these crucial products to North Africa, to the MENA region, which might be actually a much more genuine contribution to their recovery and growth than a 15 billion aid package. But sorry, perhaps this may be linked to your answer on Europe and the world, and making that the center of the conference on the future.
No, but I agree. I mean, I think all this could change the sort of paradigm in the way in which the EU engages with its neighbors and with Africa in particular. We just need to see, it's kind of early days still to see how that's going to happen. The immediate response was the 15 billion package. We need to see where it will go from now. And it seems to me that the EU at the moment is thinking about it rather than doing anything. I can actually answer your question. It so happens that today I published a very short piece, 800-word blog piece, which included this question, right? So I had to think hard about how can I boil it down to just a few words. And so I thought of, rather than looking at what needs to be reformed, what policies can be launched, etc., two concepts that perhaps should underpin the workings of the conference on the future of Europe. And the first really comes out of the pandemic, which I think has, in a way, humanized public policies, put the individual at the front, left, and center of the discussion. So if the EU can promote sort of people-first policies, that will be a different way of talking about public policy at the national level, at the EU level, at the local level. And at these three levels, we've seen a lot of activity because of the pandemic. A lot of the health measures were actually implemented at the very, very local level. A lot of the solutions were found at the very, very local level, but we also saw the need for big coordination. So I think what has happened can tell a different story. And if we put a people's first policy, I think that can change, it can bring about that element of change to the debate on Europe that might get it unstuck. And I think that same principle can also apply to, at an international level, we're talking again about global public goods, right? That debate is an old debate, but it can be renewed and updated. And we can talk about these issues and what they are in a different way. Obviously, health, the environment are the most immediate ones, but there are plenty more that we could address, which I think affect, for instance, the notion of economic production and supply chains, and migration, citizenship. There are all sorts of themes that could be addressed in more of a global context. And if the Conference on the Future of Europe also took this international dimension, then Europe could say something to the rest of the world. It wouldn't just be an introverted experiment for our benefit, but could actually engage other countries as well.
Brilliant. Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time. All good things must come to an end, as we well know. So thank you, Ilke, Nikolai, and Rosa, for that very interesting conversation. And I'm sure I'll be turning to you in the not too distant future for more food for thought. The hashtag I should have mentioned right at the beginning, which I didn't, but I'll mention it now, is coronavirus analysis. It sounds rather clinical and cold, but there you are. And the main thing, though, is that for those of you who may have missed the beginning of this very interesting debate, it will be available on our website and on YouTube very, very shortly. So without further ado, just let me thank you all. I know that we've had about 278 spectators. I don't know how many are still listening, but thank you all for listening in, and we will continue to debate these and other EU-related issues in the near future. Thank you. Goodbye and good afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.